Well, now it's 9:30 and we open Radio 3's Free Thinking Season, a series of events and discussions examining a host of ideas and proposals for the future. Over the next week, Radio 3 will examine the many ways in which we might live, work and reproduce differently in the future. The season begins with the opening lecture from the future City of Culture, Liverpool, by the musician, artist and man of ideas, Brian Eno, introduced this evening by Philip Dodd.
Hello, and welcome to Liverpool Hope University, Merseyside. It really is a great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. For me, he stands for everything that's good about the English art school tradition, an endless curiosity and a wonderful and principled disregard for orthodoxy. He's a promiscuous artist, to use the word in a celebratory way. While an art student, he started experimenting with tape recorders as musical instruments. He was as much at home in the wonderful avant-garde orchestra of Cornelius Cardrew as in the celebrated Roxy music. Not bad for someone who was a self-professed non-musician. He coined the term ambient music, and he's collaborated with artists as various as David Bowie, Paul Simon, and Talking Heads' David Byrne, as well as some of the most interesting artists from the art movement Fluxus. Engaging with science and technology, one of the founders of the Long Now Foundation, author, video maker, record label founder, he'd have a fair claim to ownership of the phrase, a man for all seasons, if someone had not already got it. So who better than Brian Eno to give this evening's Free Thinking Lecture, the opening event of this first BBC Radio 3 and Radio Merseyside Free Thinking Festival. Brian Eno.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Philip. It's 2006, and we're at the point where mankind is more numerous than it's ever been before, where we're more powerful than we've ever been before, where we can do things that even 50 years ago wouldn't have been dreamed of. We make a huge footprint on the earth. We can destroy cities with one bomb. We can build huge bridges that cross vast expanses of water. We can fly across oceans. We can do all sorts of things. But somehow the future doesn't look too good. The more we look at it, the bleaker it seems to be. And as we look around the world, we see a sort of chaos around us. So the question arises, has our intelligence actually kept up with our power? Have our brains grown as fast as our technical skills, for example? What I'd like to do this evening, having set a scene with some generally bad news, is to try to tell you what I think is the good news, about what I think are some new ways of thinking that are starting to appear, have been appearing maybe for the last 40 or 50 years, have been simmering under the surface and are suddenly starting to make themselves felt. And I want to start this story about 150 years ago, when a book was published in England which was so radical and so counterintuitive that it's still very hard for a lot of people to grasp it and to accept it. In fact, I gather it's still banned in some schools in the United States. That book was On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Now, you have to try to remember the context in which this book appeared. Victorian England with a very clear view of how things were ordered. They saw life as a kind of pyramid with God at the top, white English males next, horses and dogs, then women, and perhaps the French after that. But at least a very clear picture of how things happened, how ideas filtered through. So ideas came from God, or if you didn't happen to believe in him, they came from great men, and they filtered down through the population, sort of a intellectual version of Ronald Reagan's trickle-down theory. And of course the lower orders followed their orders and carried out the ideas of the upper orders. Darwin appeared with a theory that challenged this quite fundamentally. Because Darwin was a zoologist, it wasn't immediately clear that he was actually the most important philosopher of the last 500 years. Darwin's theory said, actually life wasn't designed by something more complicated than life. Life in all its complexity grew out of something more simple. Now this inversion is actually the most radical idea, perhaps since Copernicus pointed out that we circulated the sun rather than the other way around. And it was an idea that really threatened and unsettled the Victorian mind, and as I said, still threatens a lot of minds now. Because what it said was something quite counterintuitive. It said that rather than complicated things being made by more complicated organisms, which seems kind of natural to us, it seems a common sense idea, it said that the most complicated things that we know of, namely living creatures, actually arose from less complicated things, ultimately from dead matter. This is the theory of evolution. Now, this is a very hard idea to take on, and it took a very long time to filter through into people's consciousness. I think in the last 10 to 20 years, it actually has filtered through into people's consciousness, and it started to become one of the most important underlying thoughts of how people think their intellectual world is constructed. Along with Darwin's idea of complexity arising from simplicity was another very important idea, which he didn't have the word for. The word didn't come along until quite a lot later, which is the idea of ecology. Ecology is the notion that things are not connected in a hierarchical pyramid, as had been suggested, but that in fact they are a web, and they're a web of interdependencies, a web of things that are knitted together so intricately that we probably are never going to understand the degree of that intricacy. And a web that doesn't really have hierarchies in it. We can't easily extract parts of it and say, this is the more important part. So again, prior to Darwin, the natural historians had a fairly clear notion of what the order of things was. Again, horses often came at the top of the picture. What happened after Darwin is that we realized that all life was in some sense equally important. All life was interwoven, and we could not predict the consequences of trying to change the status of any part of it. It was too complex a position. In his modern form, Darwin re-emerged as a science which started off being called catastrophe theory, became chaos theory, then complexity theory, and is currently called emergence. Its name hasn't really stabilized yet. What emergence means is precisely the idea I was talking about earlier, that complexity comes from simplicity, that putting together a lot of simple things with a lot of simple rules generates some very complex outcomes. Again, as I say, this is counterintuitive because we normally are used to thinking that if something complex exists, like a 747 or a subway system or a steel industry, for example, that those things will have been the result of something more complex, namely a human being, thinking them out. Emergence suggests quite the opposite. It says that given a number of simple objects operating with a number of simple rules, it is possible that there will be consequences of a complexity that we can't predict, and of a type of complexity that we actually have to carry out in order to see it. We can't, in theory, make mathematical predictions about those things. I cottoned on to all of this through a piece of music, actually. It was a piece of music that really changed my life and made me rethink not only what music could be about, and particularly what my own music could be about, but how things come into being. And I suppose that one of the things that has always interested me and been a theme in my work is how are things made? How do things come to exist? This piece of music was by Steve Reich. It's called It's Gonna Rain. He made the piece in 1965. It's a very simple piece. He had a short recording of a black preacher in San Francisco screaming to the crowd about the end of the world on a street corner. And from that recording, he took 3 words, "It's gonna rain," and he made a loop of them. In fact, he made 2 identical loops that he played on 2 identical machines. I'm going to give you a little example in a moment. What's interesting about this piece is that the basic sonic material is extremely simple. It's 2 short loops, 2 identical short loops. What's fascinating about it is that as you listen to it, you hear much, much more material than you know is inside there. So I'll just play you this as an example. So what you'll hear first of all is the little fragment of recording that he took the loop from. Then you'll hear the loop playing, as it were, singly. And then I've taken a little section from later on in the piece where the 2 loops are starting to run out of phase, because he used 2 machines that did not stay locked in sync. So you have the effect of a kind of oral moiré, where two identical patterns cross each other and create a third, more powerful new pattern. So here's the original and the first loop.
He began to warn the people. He said, after a while, it's going to rain after a while, for 40 days and for 40 nights. And the people didn't believe him. And they began to laugh at him. And they began to mock him. And they began to say, it ain't going to rain. It's gonna rain, 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 it's gonna rain.
Okay, now we're going to hear from 6 minutes into this piece, which carries on pretty much like that, where the 2 loops have now slipped out of phase and are crossing over one another. So I hope Steve Reich doesn't mind me quoting such a small section of a quite long piece. What fascinated me about this was the disjunction between what I knew was in the piece, which is a very small piece of sonic material, about 2 seconds of sonic material, and what the piece actually did in my head. And it triggered me to an idea that was, at the time, quite radical. This was in the late 60s, early 70s, when people had just discovered multi-track recording and were insisting on putting very large orchestras on everything they did, and putting as many large orchestras as they could afford on everything they did. And to have a piece of music suddenly appear that was dramatically simple, just about as skeletal as it could be, and for it to affect me more than those big productions ever did, I guess that day I became a minimalist, really. I started to want to use less and less to make more and more. And a lot of my own work proceeded from this. What fascinated me, I suppose, was this new thought that the composer didn't have to do the composing. What happens in this piece is that Reich has constructed a sort of machine of some kind, a machine for making a piece of music. He, in his own writing about it, says he was as surprised as anyone else by what happened. He didn't actually intend this. He meant the tape recorders to run in sync. It was an accident initially that they weren't running at exactly the same speed. He writes about it with the same kind of bafflement that I felt listening to it. And I thought this was very interesting, that the composer should suddenly be in the same position as the listener, rather than the archetypal model of the composer having a fully formed concept in their head which they somehow bring into the world for the rest of the world to hear. That's the sort of classical idea of composition, that painters and composers and architects walk around with fully formed paintings and symphonies and buildings in their head, which they then somehow make real. This was not that kind of picture at all. This was saying what the composer does is prepares a set of conditions, a set of initial conditions, a kind of machinery, if you like, a system, and then feeds stuff into it and sees what happens. Well, this became really a theme for me of nearly everything I've done since. I mean, all the ambient records, everything that sounds long and slow that I've ever done is really based on this idea, and that's quite a lot of what I've ever done. What happened over the last few years, as long and slow caught on, and as the idea of things made as systems also caught on, is that another idea started to accompany them. And this was the idea of bottom-up art produced by communities in some way, of perhaps under the direction of an artist or at the instigation of an artist, but nonetheless not in a sort of prescriptive, predictive way. I was involved in something like this quite recently, which was called the Margate Exodus. You may have heard about it. It was something that a London organisation called Art Angel put on. It was instigated by an artist called Penny Woolcock, and her idea was to take this small town, Margate, which is sort of rather a depressed town in that it used to be a big holiday centre before everyone started flying off to Tarama-Salata or wherever it was. And so there's a lot of empty boarding houses there, so the government had the brilliant idea of putting lots of asylum seekers into the town. And this kind of exacerbated problems there somewhat. The townsfolk resented it quite a lot, and there was a generally unhappy atmosphere in the town. Penny Woolcock had the idea to do a reenactment of the book of Exodus in the Bible, which is, of course, the book of the exile of the Israelites. She wanted to try to invent a work that would involve the community and somehow resolve some of their differences. And the piece she invented, called the Margate Exodus, involved at points 7,000 people in Margate. It was a huge, huge event. And she very carefully made sure that it was a very eclectic mix of people. So there were Afghans, Iraqis, Somalis, locals, people from London, people from all over England, but generally a very, very eclectic mix. The interesting thing about this piece of work, which ultimately resulted in a performance for which I wrote a piece of music, which is how I was engaged with it, for me the most important result was that to make this piece of work she had to create a community. She worked in Margate for 3 years with people, and a very big community evolved around this piece of work. As I say, there were 7,000 people involved at one time, and I think quite actively for most of the time there were 12 or 1,500 people involved. So to create a piece of work, she had to create a community, or bring a community into being where there hadn't been one before. So you could say this work really had two outcomes. There was the media outcome, the Channel 4 piece and the performance we saw, but there was also the outcome of a community being built. And of course a lot of the people who worked in this have since become friends and have carried on to do other things. Now, I suppose one of the things that interests me about art is that what is possible in art becomes thinkable in people's lives. People see things in art and they think, do you know what, I wouldn't mind trying that myself. I suppose what interests me about this is that in pieces like the Margate Exodus, there's no longer a distinction between observer and participant, just like there wasn't a distinction between composer and listener in the previous example I cited. So hurrying very quickly now, I'd like to also mention a couple of things where this same spirit has manifested in a more social world. One of them is Move On. You may know this, moveon.org, which is an American political advocacy organization. Move On grew from a couple of guys who were so fed up by the hysteria around 9/11 that they started a website, which was quickly joined by several million people who voluntarily contribute huge amounts of money to certain liberal and progressive candidates in the United States. It's probably the biggest, most important political force in America now, and it's all done by email. And it's a community of people who suddenly feel that at last they're taking part in democracy. The other thing I should say is that there are now, according to my friend Paul Hawken, 1 million pressure groups for social justice and environmental issues. That's one pressure group for every 6,000 people on the planet. So what we're seeing is the beginning of new kinds of communities of minds and talent, communities that don't really arise from somebody having a bright idea and putting them together and commanding forces, but from something simmering up from underneath. Move On was like that, started very innocently. I had a word for this. I went to see an exhibition at the Barbican once of early 20th century Russian painting, which was the period of painting I most liked. And I suddenly realized that there were thousands of great Russian painters that I'd never heard of, even though I'd really studied the period quite well. And I realized that the whole scene was fertile. It wasn't a few geniuses followed by a lot of mediocre people. It was a fertile scene. And I came up with this idea, which I call scenius, which is the genius of a lot of people, the genius of a scene. My friend Kevin Kelly had a much nicer way of saying it. He said, everyone is smarter than anyone. Now, that notion that everyone is smarter than anyone is what underlines a lot of the really new thoughts we're seeing now. Like many of you will be familiar with Wikipedia, which is an encyclopedia, an online encyclopedia made by anyone who wants to add to it. This is such an amazing and shocking idea that this could work. And it's now the best online encyclopedia. Anyone can write in, if there's a subject that you know something about and you think someone hasn't written well about it, you go and correct it. There it is. I looked at the entry on me the other day. It's more up to date about me than I am. Another part of that is open source. Open source is a sort of wiki idea. The notion that instead of inventing something and carefully protecting it from everybody else, you invent something, lay all the rules for it wide open, and say to everybody else, can you do it any better? And as a result of this, you get commonly built code, commonly built ideas. Now there's a new thing on the horizon which is very interesting, which people are calling Wiki Science, which is that instead of publishing your paper to your peers in Nature or something like that, you put your paper on the internet and invite other people in the area to contribute to it. So we're now getting mass-authored science papers. To me, this is very exciting because this really is what we've been talking about for such a long time. Our societies are supposed to be democratic societies. Now, so far, that's been a kind of joke as far as I'm concerned. If going and making a little ink mark on a piece of paper every 5 years is your contribution to the democracy of your society, I have to say that's a huge squandering of your intelligence. What we really mean by democracy, I should think, is some way of creating systems that use all of our intelligence. And what I think I'm beginning to see now is the emergence of systems that do that. So I have to stop there for now so we can have question time. Thank you very much.
I want, if I may, though, before we turn to the audience, to ask Brian a couple of questions. One autobiographical and then one more political. It's a very interesting idea you have that a lot of the most interesting work at the moment collapses the distinction between observer and participant. And you also talked about Darwin, and Darwin had this wonderful idea that life emerged out of a tangled bank. And you were an art school boy. You know, I went to university, so I went to the proper place, which I've always regretted deeply that I didn't go to art school. But I have a feeling that art schools were one of the places you would have learned to dissolve the distinction between observer and participant.
I think they were then. I'm not sure it's still so true, but in the 60s there was a huge melting down, really, of the craft-based old art schools. And there was a conceit, which in some ways turned out to be real, that if you could understand how to be creative in one area, you could cross over to any other area. So art schools suddenly thought they ought to be teaching music and happenings and theatre and ballet and whatever anybody wanted to do, basically. And there were, of course, all endless arguments within the art schools about what the boundaries should be. You know, should we teach cookery if someone asked us to? Some of them did. but nonetheless, it was a very fruitful position to be in if you were a student and if you were, you know, not absolutely fixed on your direction.
The second question is a question, I suppose, about what you've called these kind of democratic urges. And it seems to me, and I'd like your observation on this, there are the pressure groups, extraordinarily important, growing, and technologies allowed them to grow. And then there are those kind of pleasurable happenings that I suppose we call of kind of flash mobbing, you know, that actually people turn up in a given place at a given moment because they've texted one another. And you know, this is equally so in China now. The rural protests in China are organised on people's mobile phones. Do you think there's a kind of congruence and a confluence between the kind of happenings that flash mobbing is, to use your word from the 60s, and the kind of interest in doing politics for yourself rather than having it done for you?
Yeah, I have great hopes for flash mobbing. In fact, that was one of the things I was going to mention. I think what happens with new media is that they're always exciting and radical when they appear, and they always change the world when they appear. And then, pretty quickly, the authorities learn how to keep them under control. For instance, if you think of television, which effectively ended the Vietnam War, television isn't likely to end the Iraq War because we've got it much better under control now. So the internet is still a wild card. Anything can happen still. And actually it's a pretty hard to control card because it was built to be hard to control. It was built to be hard to destroy. So I have more hopes for that than I had for television. But at the moment this medium is offering a huge freedom to us, actually. A chance to make some experiments, some social experiments that couldn't have been made before. And it's a lot to do with speed, you know, the speed of the feedback loop. To do something, or to initiate something, and then to see the results. The faster that is, the faster you can adapt. This is why architecture moves so slowly, because it takes about 25 years in your career before you can make a building. And so you get a chance maybe in your career to change your mind once.
It's interesting though, Brian, because there's a kind of paradox in what you say, which is interesting, which is you're for this immediacy, and at another level, you're one of the founders of the Long Now Foundation, and you're interested in slowness. I mean, there is a lot of deliberate slowness. There's a famous contemporary artwork by Douglas Gordon called 24 Hours Psycho, where he slows psycho down to last for 24 hours. Even popular culture, the culture my children watch, Lord of the Rings, you know, lasts, it seems to me, forever, but it's probably only for about 3.5 hours. Novels are getting longer again. Somebody's threatening to send me Thomas Pynchon's new novel, which is about 1,300 pages. How do you kind of think about time? Because there's the immediacy of, as it were, mobbing, and there's the need for long duration.
Well, I think time has become a real subject, which is interesting. We don't take time spans for granted in the same way. As you mentioned, the Long Now Foundation, this is a foundation that I helped start, which is attempting to think of the next 10,000 years. So we assume that human civilization started about 10,000 years ago when people started settling down and no longer nomads. And so we thought that we would try to think of 10,000 years from now. Not because we seriously thought we could predict what would happen in 10,000 years, but because we thought that if you had that time frame in mind, it would start to change the way you were behaving now. If you seriously thought that humans might be around for that long, you would start to make different decisions here and now. And we've initiated some projects which are designed to last for 10,000 years. And
do you want to give us one example?
Well, one of them is called the Clock of the Long Now, which is a hard to explain example. It's a mechanical computer, basically, which we think we've built 4 prototypes, one of which is actually in the Science Museum in London, if you ever want to see it. And we're about to build an 85-foot high one in the Nevada desert. And the idea is to try to make something that will last for 10,000 years, not because we're particularly interested in clocks, but because we're interested in thinking about what happens if you try to think of something lasting that long, and you actually try to face the problems that would involved in making something to last that long. For example, you have to take into account the possibility that there are going to be 3 or 4 dark ages between now and then. So what do you do? How do you build that into your calculations? So that's a kind of icon for us, the Clock of the Long Now, a way of trying to inspire people to think long term. And what often happens is that people say, oh, it's mad thinking about a clock lasting that long. I mean, dust could get into it, or blah, blah, blah. And as soon as they start talking, of course, they're thinking long term. That's the whole point of the thing.
Let's turn it out and engage everyone in the conversation, or as many everyone as we possibly can. First question's from James Woodhousen of De Montfort University.
Fascinated by your talk. In his March 2005 budget, Gordon Brown, perhaps our next Prime Minister, looked forward to users of the National Health Service co-producing the services of the future with professionals. I wonder how far you want to stretch your concept, because when I go in for an appendix operation, I'd rather not co-produce it with the surgeon.
This reminds me of, I published a pack of cards many years ago called Oblique Strategies, which are sort of aphorisms to help artists when they're stuck. You know, they have sort of little ideas like cut a vital connection, or destroy everything and start again, things like that. And I once met a brain surgeon who said he used them often, which was very alarming. But
could you tell us who he is so we can avoid him at all costs?
So I don't know about Gordon Brown's initiative in that respect. I presume he doesn't actually mean that you would do it live during the operation. He presumably means that you would help co-produce it before the operation starts.
But I think there's a question of kind of professional competence. Mm-hmm. You know, in other words, you worked on the Margate project, but you were a professional brought into it to work with others. In other words, there is a differentiation of kind of competence that you have to acknowledge.
Well, interestingly, though, the piece of music that I wrote was then performed by non-professional musicians. So all right, I wrote a piece, but they performed it, and they in fact reinvented it, because they didn't know how I'd made it. I made it with all sorts of sophisticated computer electronics, and they played it on instruments. So.
Another question from Roger Hill.
You use the word counterintuitive a lot. Is this the time to be counterintuitive, and what was wrong with intuition in the first place?
That's a very, very good question. Thank you for asking it. Intuition is, of course, what the seat of the pants that artists fly by, but intuition is also quite unreliable. It doesn't always give you the right answers by any means. Wittgenstein used to do an exercise with his students, which I shall describe quickly. Imagine you tied a ribbon around the Earth. Imagine the Earth as a perfect globe. You want to tie a ribbon around it. So you tied the ribbon, but damn, you realized you'd made it a yard too long. But you have godlike powers, so you can make the ribbon float just above the surface of the Earth. It'll sort of hover there, evenly far off the Earth all the way around. So his question was, how far do you think that would be? Now, most people, including me, answer this question with 0.0001 of a millimetre, or some minute figure. In fact, the answer is just under 6 inches, which to me is so strange that when I heard this as a student, I stayed up a whole night working out over and over again, and it turns out to be true. So intuition doesn't always lead you to the right answer. In fact, the only two people I've ever asked that question of who've got it right were a mathematician, who worked out in his head immediately, and a dressmaker, who knew what looseness meant.
You're listening to the Free Thinking Lecture with Brian Eno, and I'd like to invite Daniel Land, please.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your seniors concept in relation to the new kind of curatorship that we're seeing through things like MySpace and YouTube. What are we converging on, and what does it show about us?
Yes, I wanted to talk about MySpace and YouTube as well, because in a sense I think these are models for, well, they're sort of the open source version of the broadcast arts in a way. It's everybody put your sixpenneth in, and then we'll see what rises to the top. And I have to say, I look at YouTube nearly every breakfast time now. It's become a sort of habit. I just like to see what new things are coming up, because occasionally you see something that is truly, totally surprising. You know, you think this couldn't have come out through television. This couldn't have come out through any system that had any sense of craft or any sense of good taste. And of course, therefore, it's often very interesting. So I think what we're seeing is an instance of that Kevin Kelly statement I quoted: everybody is smarter than anyone. There are a set of consensuses arising about different things which were not in anybody's mind to start with. You know, no single individual had the thought, but somehow the thought has come up. And this is a very interesting transition in the human mind. It's sort of like a clan mind, but on a global level. It's something that we haven't really seen for many thousands of years, I imagine. I think that probably early humans lived in bands that were very closely connected, and probably didn't feel themselves to be individuals in the way that we think we are now. In fact, you still see this in some societies where people are totally bereft to be separated from people. They don't have any of this feeling of how wonderful it would be to be alone that we have. They want to be together all the time. And I'm starting to wonder whether we're going back to a sort of global version of that position now, a global version of thinking, I'm not complete any longer. I need to be part of the scene. Now, paradoxically, the same technologies and skills that have given us all the power that I mentioned earlier have also done something which is quite the opposite. They've made us realize how individually insignificant we are. You know, we have the Hubble Space Telescope and other wonderful devices, and we look out to space and we discover that we're a little planet circling a medium-sized sun, of which there are 100 trillion others. And then we look at time and we find that time is boundlessly long, a story that's been going on for ever and ever and ever, and we're just a comma in that story. And there's that beautiful phrase of Hildegard de Bingen, the 12th century Christian mystic. One of her pieces of music is called A Feather on the Breath of God. And this sort of realization that actually we're tiny and our being here or not doesn't really make any difference to anything, somehow feeds that sense of an erosion of individual self-importance and a conflation of the importance of the group, the unity of the tribe, if you like.
Can I press you on that? Because there's another way of reading YouTube and MySpace. It's not our space. It's my space. Mm-hmm. It's not plural YouTube, but it's you, singular. And there is a way in which, and not necessarily bad, there's a kind of democratization of creativity, but an assertion of self. You know, my space.
But I don't find that objectionable. I think, hasn't this always been the case, that people want to be part of something and at the same time want to be in some way distinguished as separate? I have a friend who has a brilliant new idea for a political party which she wants to call the picnic party, because she thinks that people are happiest when they're having picnics. And for her, the picnic is a sort of a model of what we all want to do. We all want to be sort of engaged in something together, which is a bit of an adventure, has a few challenges. You have to do a bit of preparation for it. Lots of different skills could be required. And, you know, at the picnic, there's no reason why you shouldn't tell jokes and I shouldn't play a song, and we should do our different things. But nonetheless, we all know that having the picnic on your own wouldn't be that much fun.
I don't like picnics. Andy Heath, please.
Do you see a future House of Commons where the debate and the vote on any issue could involve anyone and everyone? Would it lead to a more evolved society, or would it lead to mob rule?
Well, I think that's not far-fetched. What it depends on, of course, is that there aren't too many very powerful voices in public opinion. At the moment, we have a sort of media bottleneck. There aren't that many TV channels, and there aren't that many papers, and most of them are owned by rather unpleasant people, in my opinion. So we have a kind of filtration of opinions through a very small number of rather tight bottlenecks. So at the moment, if such a system existed, I would be terrified of it. You know, if I thought the 4 million readers of the paper I can't mention on the BBC, which is sort of in tabloid form and has Gothic writing on the top of it, if I thought that they were sitting trigger finger on their modems, I would be seriously worried. But I think that public opinion is going to evolve a lot soon. Somebody I was listening to recently, Lester Brown, the ecologist, said he felt that the world at the moment was like the Soviet Union in 1988. Everything looks solid and stuck and pretty much in place, and nothing's ever going to change. But in a few months, it's all going to be different. And this is rather what I feel. I feel we're reaching a sort of critical mass in terms of human thinking and the ability of humans to cooperate with one another. And so when that critical mass is reached, then I'll be happy to take part in a system like that.
Sean McHugh?
You sound very progressive in your outlook, and I wouldn't want to dissent from that. But my question takes the opposite run. Is there such a thing as right-wing art? And what would be your take on that?
Well, to answer that question, I have to first of all tell you what I think art is, and what I think it possibly isn't. So I have this definition of art, which is art is everything you don't have to do. And by that I mean you have to wear clothes, but they don't have to be high-fashion clothes. You have to eat, but you don't have to invent wonderful cuisines. You have to move, but you don't have to dance, basically. So what I think of as art is the whole stylistic layer of stuff that we do on top of the things we have to do to stay alive. Now, that stylistic layer is a sort of rich area of human play, and it's interesting to note that we don't know of any humans that don't do it. Every human society that we've ever found out about puts a stylistic overlay on what they do as soon as they possibly can, even when they're very poor. Remember, people made paintings in Auschwitz. You know, people have continued to be artists and to want to look at art in the most desperate of circumstances. So it makes you think that there's something quite deeply biological about this process. And to abbreviate my forthcoming book, which will be no doubt 972 pages long, into the space of a few minutes. I think that what humans are doing when they engage in this world is they're rehearsing and celebrating and enjoying the thing that humans do better than any other creatures, in fact, possibly exclusively, which is to create false worlds for themselves, imaginary worlds, and then inhabit them and see what it feels like. Now, the strength of that as a human talent is that everything we see around us was the result of that process. Humans have this unique ability to imagine a world and imagine inhabiting it and imagine what it would be like, and then to choose whether to do it or not. That's called imagination, obviously, but imagination is something bigger than just that as well. Imagination is the ability for me to kind of have some grasp of what might be in your mind. It's the ability to have empathy. And there's a thing that psychologists call theory of mind, which is, I know what Philip is thinking about this guy here who's just said something to his son, and I know what his son is thinking as well. You know, it's the ability to extrapolate a lot of minds and to hold them in your own mind at once. Now, apparently, we are almost unique in being able to do this. Even our 98% cousins, the very bright bonobos and chimps, only seem to be able to have one level of theory of mind. That's to say, this chimp knows what Martin here is thinking. That's all. But he doesn't know what Martin is thinking about his son. So I think that the most fundamental thing in human society is our ability to imagine in terms of what we can do and in terms of how we can be with one another. If you think that that's important enough to be called art, that's about what I think art is and what I think it's about. Of course, art is very attractive and seductive. It ought to be, and it has to be. And it's therefore very easy to use it as a container for messages as well. For me, messages have very little to do with art. I'm not interested in messages. I'm interested in experiences and in immersion of some kind in an experience, in a mental experience. What happens with propagandistic art is that people say, oh yes, I understand, people have got a taste for this kind of experience, so let's put a message in it as well. It's a kind of, art is a kind of packaging in that case. And I feel generally uninterested in that kind of art. And of course, it exists and you have to pay attention to it. But its wing, its right or left wing, has very little to do with what it does to me as art. Do you see what I mean? That's a sort of meta message. For instance, some of the most beautiful paintings I've seen in the last 20 years are the paintings of a Russian socialist realist called Helium Korshev, who was a kind of communist salon painter employed by the state. He happened to be a truly great painter. It happened that his message was a message that the government liked. The message doesn't really interest me at all. The paintings interest me, but the message could be taken out and it wouldn't make the paintings any less interesting to me. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but what I'm trying to say is that there are two separate layers. There's the art and there's the message, and generally I can do without the message.
Tony Heslop?
On Monday there's going to be an announcement about the major events for Liverpool's Year of Culture in 2008. And of course, those will require a great deal of organisation. Is there still scope for a fair amount of bottom-up cultural activity?
I think there is. I think there's always so much of it happening in cities, which in general the city authorities don't pay much attention to. For instance, I was asked once to help design a park in Barcelona, nothing came of this actually, but the original idea of the park was that it should involve big state-of-the-art sort of theme parky type things, which struck me as not a very good idea, because it would have to then be so expensive that nobody from Barcelona would be able to afford to go there. So I suggested, why didn't they make state-of-the-art rollerboard tracks and skateboard tracks, and make places where all the things that kids do in a city anyway could be done in the grand style, you know. And I think that would be a very interesting thing for cities to do, just to look around and see what people are up to, and kind of invite them to do more of it and to do it better. So that would be a nice theme for Liverpool, wouldn't it? City of culture. It's cheap too.
Then it will appeal to the political class anywhere. Mark Jones?
My question relates to the question 2 back about music. Talking about the Wikipedia and the open source concepts, where anyone can get involved and put their opinions in and put their ideas into something. I know that David Bowie, a few years ago, on his website, he started making pieces of music, and then he opened up to his fans and asked them to collaborate or co-write the pieces of music, and it relates to what you said about yours and David Byrne's Bush of Ghosts thing as well. Do you think that could ever lead to a kind of democratic music making or communal music making that might sort of take over and wrestle the power away from the big corporations that control the music, popular music in the world today? Can you see it happening for yourself? Do you have ideas about that?
Well, I've been so impressed with the things that have happened on this Bush of Ghosts remix website. I mean, it's a very mixed bunch of stuff. You know, there are some things that aren't really very interesting, but there are some things that are really very striking. And so I thought, do you know what? I could make a whole album like this. I'll just put the bits on the internet and let other people assemble it for me. And I'm sort of seriously thinking of this idea now, that this might really be an interesting future for a record. The other thing we have on the Bush of Ghosts website is we have a chart which people can vote on. So people decide which of those remixes they like best. And it's very interesting that they are consistently right. I mean, whatever turns up at the top of the chart is actually the one I like best too. Almost without exception. You know, maybe sometimes I like the second one a bit better, but so this process seems to be working, and I'm wondering really about what would you have to put onto a website? What sort of bits and pieces would you have to put on to end up with some really original and new music? So yes, it is a little project in the back of my mind.
And Brian, it's an interesting issue you've just raised, and it's a big question, so I'll need you to be brief. The democratic impulse and the impulse about what is valuable sometimes come together and sometimes don't. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile the fact that some things matter more than others, some things are more important than others, and the democratic impulse sometimes doesn't acknowledge that?
I have a friend who's an architect, Rem Koolhaas, and he did quite a lot of work in Nigeria. And he said, when you first go to Nigeria, your impression is of total chaos. In Lagos, the traffic in Lagos is completely chaotic. People are on the wrong side of the road. There's no sort of consensus about side of the road or who crosses when or when things stop and start. He said, so the first thing you see is utter chaos. When you look closer, what you see is constant negotiation. You see constant small negotiations between people and vehicles and other vehicles and cattle and whatever else is on the streets. So this struck me as a sort of image of the kind of world we might be going into, one where there aren't really very, very hard and clear and permanent rules about things, but where there's a constant negotiation going on. Now, funnily enough, there is a manifestation of this at the moment. In Holland, they're experimenting now with a new road system invented by a man whose name I can't remember. And essentially the way it works is in busy thoroughfares and cities and towns, what you do is take away every single traffic sign and see what happens. So instead of putting in more regulation, You take it all out. And the very interesting thing is that people and cars have to negotiate with each other. And they do. The cars slow down, allow people to cross. It suddenly works. This is rather amazing that by taking the rules out, the thing self-regulates. So what I'm imagining might happen is a sort of more apparently chaotic, but actually second-to-second self-regulating system.
Justin, please. He only has one name.
You're obviously very, very optimistic about things, and you've got a kind of a positive view. And I just want, in a sense, something that I've noticed, because I sort of work with websites, is that the rise of complexity is actually has negative effects as well. And I just wondered...
Has a what, sorry?
Has negative effects.
Yes.
And in fact, you think about banks and the NHS and the reliance on systems and government and so on, you start to realise that there's a whole nest of complexities building up. And I just wonder what you think of that curve, that rising complexity, versus the positive outcomes of sort of greater connectedness. You know, just there's a tension between these two spaces.
A lot of the complexity that you're talking about and complaining about, I would also complain about, because it's the wrong sort. You know, complexity isn't all good. It's an attempt to fix an already bad system by complexifying it further. So the example I just gave of the approach to traffic management is a very good example of that. What happens in traditional traffic management is that you add more signs. So you make it more complex, basically. But by making something more tightly regulated like that, you actually restrict the possibilities of it self-regulating. This became very clear to me with another piece of music, which was a piece by Cornelius Cardew called The Great Learning, paragraph 7. It's a piece of music that always sounds pretty much the same, which to my ear is beautiful, but which has almost no structural rules whatsoever. Any group of people could do it. You don't have to be able to read music or anything. It's only for voices, but you don't have to be able to sing. And somehow this piece of music comes out always sounding pretty similar and very lovely. So I was so fascinated by this, I wrote an essay about it, actually, which you might like to read if you're interested in this subject of complexity. It's called Generating and Organizing Variety. And the thesis of the essay is that the fewer rules that you have, if they're the right kind of rules, the more chance there is of something becoming internally self-regulating. And what I think the internet model is heading towards, rather than the traditional traffic management model, is to a paucity of rules, of well-chosen rules. This is something that you see also in the work that people like Stephen Wolfram have done with cellular automata, where you have 3 simple rules that produce beautifully unpredictable results.
I'm afraid that really is all we have time for this evening. I had high hopes of this lecture by Brian, and they've been fulfilled. And they've been fulfilled, I suppose, because a festival that thinks itself as a festival for ideas for the future inevitably entails having to imagine the future in order to get us there. And it does seem to me in certain kinds of ways this evening, Brian's helped us to a kind of imagine a future that's already partly here in the present. And also, of course, he's allowed us to rethink the past in certain ways. So as he was talking, I thought of the great English cathedrals who have no author. Or I thought of Florentine painting in the 14th century that was a kind of collaborative act of negotiation between patron and painter. So I'm very grateful to Brian this evening for kind of sharing a way of just seeing the world slightly differently, tilting it left, tilting it right, seeing the everyday in a new way. I'd also like to thank you this evening for the range of questions and for your attentiveness. And so could I thank Brian Eno very much on our behalf. Thank you.
Free Thinking lecture was given by Brian Eno and presented by Philip Dodd. The producer was Kirsty Pope.